Forget the marble villas. Forget the mosaic floors, the fountains, the couches, the slaves pouring wine. That is how the movies show ancient Rome, and it is how perhaps one Roman in 100 actually lived. Here is the truth. The greatest city of the ancient world, the city of 1,000,000 people, was a city of apartment buildings. Vast, crowded, towering blocks of flats, 5, 6, even 7 stories high, packed side by side along dark, narrow streets, housing the overwhelming majority of Rome's population, tens of thousands of buildings holding hundreds of thousands of people, stacked on top of each other in the world's first true high-rise city. The Romans called such a building an insula, an island, because each block stood like an island in the sea of streets. And life inside these islands was unlike anything you have ever been shown about Rome. Buildings so shoddily constructed that collapse was a routine fact of city life, and Romans went to bed genuinely unsure whether their home would be standing in the morning. Buildings where, in a complete reversal of the modern world, the higher you lived, the poorer you were, because there were no elevators, no water above the ground floor, and no way out when the fires came. Buildings with no kitchens, so that an entire city of 1,000,000 people ate takeout every day from thousands of hot food counters. Buildings where the sewage went out the window, where the law had to specifically address what happened when a falling chamber pot hit a passerby, and where the noise of the city was so relentless that Romans complained you could not sleep in Rome unless you were rich. Today we are going inside the Roman insula, floor by floor, from the shops at street level to the desperate rooms under the roof tiles, to discover how the real Romans, the ordinary million, actually lived. Using advanced AI trained on the archaeology of Rome and of Ostia, the port city whose surviving apartment blocks still stand stories high today on the writings of the Roman authors who lived in and complained bitterly about these buildings, on Roman law, which is full of apartment disputes, and on the work of historians who have reconstructed the daily life of the ancient city, we have rebuilt the world of the insula. Step off the street, into the dark stairwell, and start climbing. The higher we go, the harder life gets. First, understand why these buildings existed at all, because the insula was the answer to a problem no city had ever faced before. Rome, by the height of the empire, held around 1,000,000 people, a population no city on earth had ever reached, and would not be matched in Europe again for well over 1,000 years. And all those people had to fit inside a surprisingly small space. The practical city was hemmed in by hills, by the river, by the sacred boundary, and by the simple fact that everyone needed to live within walking distance of their work, their markets, and the public fountains, because the only transport for ordinary people was their own feet. 1,000,000 people, walking distance, limited land. There is only one solution to that equation, and the Romans found it: build upward. And so Rome grew into the sky. The ancient sources speak of buildings climbing story upon story until emperors had to pass laws limiting their height, first to around 70 feet, later slightly lower, laws which tell us two things at once: that buildings were routinely reaching those heights, and that they were falling down often enough that the state had to intervene. By the time of the empire's height, a famous survey of the city's buildings recorded tens of thousands of insulae against fewer than 2,000 private houses. Read that again. For every wealthy family in a private house with its courtyard and its frescoes, there were roughly 25 apartment blocks packed with everyone else. The Rome of the movies, the Rome of atriums and gardens, was a thin crust of privilege floating on an ocean of flats. The real Rome looked less like a costume drama and more like a rough, loud, ancient version of a modern city's densest districts. Canyons of tall buildings, washing strung between them, shops spilling onto the pavement, stairwells breathing cooking smoke and noise, and above the street, story after story of small rented rooms rising toward the light. Now stand in front of one and look at how it was built, because the construction of the insula is the first key to everything that happened inside it. The better class of insula, and the surviving examples at Rome's port of Ostia show us these, was genuinely impressive. A sturdy frame of Roman concrete faced with neat brickwork, vaulted ceilings on the lower floors, large windows in orderly rows, balconies, elegant brick door frames, a building that would not look absurd on a street today. Roman concrete was one of the wonders of the age, and when the builders used it honestly, an insula could stand for centuries. Some fragments still do. But honest construction cost money, and the insula was, above everything else, a machine for making money. These buildings were investment properties thrown up by developers and landlords to farm rent from the endless flood of people pouring into the capital, and the pressure at every stage was to build fast, build cheap, and build tall. Contemporary writers are scathing about the results. They describe buildings propped up rather than repaired, landlords papering over cracks, walls of rubble and cheap timber, upper stories of light wooden framing stacked on top of masonry never meant to carry them. The satirist Juvenal, who has left us the most vivid picture of insular life we possess, wrote bitterly that Rome was held up on slender props, that the manager would patch a gaping ancient crack and then tell the tenants to sleep soundly while the building hung over them ready to come down. He said in one of the darkest jokes ever made about housing that in the country towns a man could live without fear of his roof, but in Rome people dwelt in a city propped on matchsticks. And the collapses came. Roman literature and law treat the falling apartment block as a normal urban catastrophe, like fire or flood. Buildings that simply gave way in the night, burying tenants in their sleep, walls that peeled off into the street. The great fortunes of some Roman speculators were built directly on this misery. It was said of one of the richest men of the late Republic that he grew wealthy, buying up buildings that were on fire or about to collapse at panic prices from their desperate owners with his private crew of builder slaves standing by. Housing, in ancient Rome, was a predator's market, and the tenants were the prey. Hold that image, the tall, handsome, brick-faced building with rot in its bones, because now we are going inside, and we are going to climb it from bottom to top. And here is the rule that governs everything in the vertical world of the insula, the rule that is the exact opposite of a modern apartment tower. In Rome, altitude was poverty. The higher you climbed, the poorer, hotter, thirstier, and more endangered you became. The penthouse of ancient Rome was the worst address in the building. The ground floor belonged to money and noise. Fronting the street, built into the base of nearly every insula, were the Tabernae, the shops, single, high, vaulted rooms opening directly onto the pavement through wide doorways closed at night with wooden shutters. Here was the true commercial life of Rome. Thousands upon thousands of these little establishments, bakers, cobblers, barbers, wine sellers, cloth dealers, metal workers, laundries, and everywhere the hot food counters we will come to shortly. The shopkeeper often lived where he worked, in a mezzanine loft above the shop reached by a ladder, his whole family and stock in one vertical sliver of the building, his workshop open to the street from dawn, his shutters rattling down at dark. If the insula was a good one, the rest of the ground floor, and perhaps the first floor above it, held the building's few genuinely desirable homes. Spacious apartments of several rooms, with the big windows, the plastered and painted walls, sometimes even a private latrine and a water connection, rented by prosperous tradesmen, minor officials, families of substance who could not afford or did not want a full private house. These lower floor tenants enjoyed the insula's only comforts. They did not have to climb. They could get water. They could get out quickly when things went wrong. And things going wrong in this building was only ever a matter of time. Even their comfort, though, came with the city attached, because the Roman street did not sleep. Wheeled delivery traffic was banned from the streets by day, precisely because the crowds were too dense, which meant every cart in Rome moved at night, iron-shod wheels on stone paving, drivers cursing, whips cracking, under the windows of 1 million people trying to rest. The same satirist swore that the sick died in Rome from lack of sleep alone, that the wagons in the narrow winding streets and the swearing of stalled drivers would deny sleep to an emperor. The insula had no glass in most of its windows, only shutters and screens. The street was not outside your home, it was practically in it. Climb the first dark flight of stairs and the building begins to change around you. The stairways of an insula were narrow, steep, and black, lit, if at all, by a lamp bracket, climbing between floors whose ceilings grew lower with every level, because the builders economized as they rose. On the middle floors, the apartments shrank. Where the first floor might hold a family in 4 or 5 rooms, the third held them in 2, and the plaster was rougher, the windows smaller, the tenants poorer, labourers, porters, minor craftsmen, soldiers' families, the vast working population that kept the million-person city alive. And with every step upward, 3 lifelines stretched thinner. The first was water. Rome, famously, had magnificent water. The aqueducts poured a river into the city every day, feeding hundreds of public fountains and basins. But with rare exceptions, that water stopped at the ground. There was no plumbing rising through the insula, no tap on the 4th floor. Every drop used by every household above street level was carried up, in jars and buckets, on someone's shoulders, from the fountain at the corner, up the black stairs, flight after flight, every single day. Families sent their children, the poor carried for themselves, those slightly better off paid water carriers. When you picture the insula, picture this above all, the endless, aching, daily procession of water going upstairs. The second lifeline was sanitation, and here we must be honest because it defined the texture of city life. The grand Roman sewers served the streets and the public latrines, and the public latrines themselves were sociable, bench-lined places where Romans sat side by side without embarrassment. But the sewers did not climb stairs any more than the water did. The apartments above had chamber pots, and the chamber pots had to be emptied. The conscientious carried them down to the vats and cesspits, or to the dung heaps, or sold the contents to the fullers, who used urine, collected in jars at street corners, to wash the city's clothes. The less conscientious opened the shutters and used the window. This was common enough that Roman law dealt with it directly. The jurists discussed liability for objects and liquids thrown from apartments onto passers-by below, and the satirists advised that a man walking Rome at night should count himself lucky if the windows above only emptied basins on him. Falling pots, and worse, were a recognized hazard of the Roman street. When you read that the ancient city smelled, this is what it means: 1 million people, no plumbing above the ground floor, and gravity doing the rest. The third lifeline was simply escape. Every floor you climbed was a floor further from the only exit, down a single wooden staircase, and in the insula, that arithmetic was ultimately a matter of life and death, for reasons the whole city understood and feared above everything else. But before we come to the fire, we must eat, because it is dinner time in the insula, and there is no kitchen in this entire building. Here is one of the strangest and most modern facts about ancient Rome. It was a city that lived on takeout. The typical insular apartment had no kitchen. There was no chimney, no oven, no hearth. At most, a tenant might risk a small charcoal brazier for warmth or to heat a pot, and every brazier was a small gamble with the building's life, because open flame in a structure laced with dry timber was the thing everyone feared. Cooking, in any real sense, was simply not possible for most of the city's population at home. The city's answer was the thermopolium, the hot food counter, and Rome and its towns had them in astonishing numbers. In the buried streets of Pompeii and in Ostia, they survive by the dozen, and scholars estimate such establishments existed across Roman cities in the hundreds per town. Picture a wide masonry counter fronting the street, faced with coloured marble fragments, with big round openings in its top, the mouths of sunken jars, holding the day's offerings, shelves of wine jugs behind, a painted menu or a cheerful fresco on the wall, a bench or a small back room for those who wanted to sit, and a proprietor ladling out the ancient equivalent of fast food. What did the insular dweller eat there? The staples of the Roman poor: hot spiced wine, coarse bread, porridges and stews of grain and beans, lentils, chickpeas, cheese, olives, salted fish, sausage, whatever meat the counter offered that day. Excavators of one famous counter found traces of duck, pig, goat, fish and snail in the same vessels, the whole Roman street food repertoire in one shop. Morning and evening, the counters were the insula's true kitchen and its living room, the place tenants ate, drank, gossiped, gambled, argued and kept warm. Respectable Romans of the upper classes sneered at the food counters as dens of the idle poor, and emperors repeatedly tried to regulate what they could sell, which tells you exactly how central they were to ordinary life. The rich dined reclining in their private dining rooms, the million ate standing at the counter, from the jar on the street. At the other institution the insula made necessary, the public bath, where for a trivial coin the tenant of a cramped, waterless room could soak in heated pools in marble halls, and you see the great bargain of Roman urban life. The city gave its crowded poor magnificent shared spaces, water, baths, food counters, fountains, latrines, porticos, temples, spectacles, precisely because their private space was a bare room up 4 flights of stairs. A Roman's apartment was where he slept. The city itself was where he lived. Keep climbing to the top of the stairs, to the floors under the roof, and meet the people the whole system pressed hardest. The top floors of the insula were the cheapest addresses in Rome, and they were cheap for reasons a tenant felt in his body every day. The rooms up here were the smallest in the building, single cells divided by thin partitions, with low ceilings directly beneath the roof tiles, which meant baking heat in the Roman summer and cold in winter, with no heating but a brazier no sane person wanted to light. Every jar of water stood at the price of 5 flights of stairs. Every trip to the latrine, the fountain, the food counter, the world meant the whole black staircase down and up again. The poet Martial, who lived the insular life himself and joked about it constantly, complained of climbing 3 flights and high ones to his lodgings. Below him, on the ladder of the stairs, lived people who would have envied him. Up here lived the city's poorest renters, labourers hired by the day, porters, newcomers from the countryside chasing the capital's promise, the old, the unlucky, the failed, and even up here the rent was brutal. Rome's rents were notoriously the highest in the world. Ancient writers remark that the cost of a dark garret in Rome could pay for a house and garden in a country town. Most tenants did not pay by the year, but scraped together their rent day by day, and the law and literature are full of the results. Tenants in arrears, landlords seizing their goods, evictions, the endless churn of the desperate through the city's rented rooms. Behind many an insula stood a chain of exploitation, an owner who leased the whole building to a middleman, who sublet it floor by floor at a markup, who squeezed the tenants below him, every layer taking its cut of the poverty above. And over the whole crowded, creaking, top-heavy structure hung the 2 catastrophes every tenant lived with as facts of life, the way coastal people live with storms. The first we have met: collapse, the crack in the wall, the sag in the ceiling, the night the props gave way. The second was worse: fire. Fire was the nightmare of the insular city, and everyone in Rome knew it. Consider what the city was: tens of thousands of tall buildings, their upper floors framed and floored in dry timber, packed along streets sometimes narrow enough for the upper storeys to lean toward each other, every room lit by oil lamps and warmed by braziers, every food counter burning charcoal, and the water, remember, all at ground level, in fountains, with no pumps worth the name and no way to raise it. Fires broke out constantly, and once a blaze got into the upper floors of one insula, it leapt the narrow streets from building to building and became a district-eating monster. Rome burned, in whole or in part, again and again. The most famous of all its fires, in the reign of Nero, raged for days on end and destroyed or damaged the great majority of the city's districts, an urban catastrophe on a scale the ancient world had never seen, fed street by exactly the buildings we have been climbing through. The state's answer was the vigiles, the watchmen, a corps of thousands of firefighter police who patrolled the city by night with buckets, axes, hooks, and primitive pumps, whose main tactic against a serious blaze was demolition, tearing down the buildings in the fire's path to starve it, and whose patrols also hauled in burglars and checked that householders kept water stored as required. They were brave, numerous, and, against a real fire in that city, very nearly helpless. For the tenant on the top floor, the arithmetic was merciless, and every Roman writer knew it. The fire starts below you. The single wooden staircase, your only way down, is the chimney the fire climbs first. The satirist put it with terrible simplicity. The ground floor is already ablaze while the man in the attic, up where the gentle doves nest under the tiles, does not yet know it. He will be the last to burn, and he was the last to be warned. Tenants slept knowing this. Some kept ropes. The prudent poor, one writer observed, could at least carry everything they owned in one hand as they ran. Collapse and fire, rent and stairs, heat and thirst. That was the tax the top of the building levied on the bottom of society. And yet, and this is the thing that must be said with equal force, the Insula was not simply a horror. It was also, for hundreds of thousands of people, home, and around its stairwells and doorways ran the dense, loud, irrepressible life of the greatest city on earth. Neighbours who knew everything about each other through the thin partitions, children on the stairs, laundry on lines between the buildings, the barber and the baker at the door, the fountain gossip, the counter wine, the festivals when the whole street ate together, the sheer electric fact of living at the centre of the world. People fought their way into Rome and into these buildings from all over the empire and kept coming, generation after generation, because for all its dangers, the insular city offered what the countryside never could: work, spectacle, possibility, the free grain of the state, the baths, the games, the chance. The Insula was a hard bargain. 1 million people took it. So that is the real Rome, the one the movies never show. Not a city of villas, but a city of islands. Tens of thousands of tall, teetering apartment blocks, built for rent, propped and patched, holding the true Roman people, the shopkeepers in their lofts above the shutters, the solid families of the lower floors with their painted walls and their precious ground-level water, the workers of the middle stories hauling their jars up the black stairs, and the poor of the top floors, under the tiles, paying the most in sweat and danger for the least in space and safety, in the world's first high-rise city, where altitude ran downhill from wealth to poverty, the exact reverse of our own. A city with no kitchens and 1,000 hot counters, no private water and 100 glorious fountains, no space at home and marble acres of shared magnificence. A city that solved the problem of 1 million people with concrete, stairs, aqueducts and takeout, 18 centuries before anyone else faced the problem at all. And a city whose ordinary life we can still touch. Walk the streets of Ostia today, and the insulae stand around you to the second and third story, brick doorframes and stair treads worn by feet that climbed them with water jars. Stand at the excavated counters of the food shops, and you can see the round mouths of the jars that fed the crowd. Read the jurists, and there are the falling chamber pots, the tenants in arrears, the cracked walls. Read the poets, and you can hear it, the carts screaming past the shutters at midnight, the landlord on the stairs, the neighbours cough through the partition. The emperors built the monuments, and the monuments got the marble and the fame. But the real Rome, the Rome that worked and ate and climbed and endured, lived in the islands. 1 million people stacked 7 stories into the sky, on props and hope, at the centre of the world. That was the greatest city of antiquity, not a palace, an apartment block. And the next time someone shows you Rome as a marble villa, remember the man in the attic, up where the doves nest under the tiles, listening to the stairs, keeping his rope coiled by the window, living, like almost everyone in the eternal city, several floors above the ground and one bad night from losing it all.